horse gallops across a field. A franchise makes the difficult transition from 2D to 3D. A targeting system revolutionizes 3D combat. A boy grows into a man. A review of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time practically writes itself. It will likely remain the most critically acclaimed game of all time, both a testament to how groundbreaking it was upon release and as a commentary of the state of numerical scores as time marches on. However, as the release of Ocarina of Time continues to fade into the past, I can't help but wonder how new generations of gamers will perceive this heralded classic. You see, 40 years ago, this was revolutionary, cutting edge, a paradigm shift in entertainment, and undoubtedly influential. These now rudimentary games shaped and inspired the children that would go on to create the beloved games of the 1990s, and Ocarina of Time no doubt inspired the games being created today. One might ponder though, will this be beloved by all generations of gamers when it turns 40, or will it be viewed as a quaint reminder of gaming's past? Even now, at just 20 years old, Ocarina of Time sits on the fault lines of two distinct generations of gamers. Some might view Ocarina of Time as the moment the Zelda franchise lost its way, losing the open world nature of the original games, where most of the overworld was always accessible for exploring and dungeon order was not set in stone. For this generation, Ocarina of Time marks the beginning of hand-holding and a more linear design approach, and with it, the franchise moved in a different direction. For the next generation, Ocarina of Time marks the point where the Zelda franchise finally found its footing. The story went from something bookending the gameplay at the beginning and the end to something the player actually experienced themselves. The franchise grew up into something far more cinematic and mature. With these two perspectives in mind, I know whatever conclusion I reach in this video will be wrong by some faction of this fractured fanbase. Declaring Ocarina of Time to be a massive leap forward means I'm some millennial failing to understand what made the franchise so great. Declaring Ocarina of Time flawed or overrated, and I'm a boomer who is stuck in the past. And of course, whatever opinion I have will seem dated and misguided 20 years from now. It is a conundrum I'm aware of, but cannot escape. At its core, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time is a straightforward adventure game. There is an overworld to explore and dungeons to conquer. The player is initially tasked with finding 3 spiritual stones in 3 dungeons. After completing this, a second act begins, tasking the player with awakening 5 sages locked away in 5 temples. The structure is not dissimilar to A Link to the Past, where Link first finds 3 pendants, and the second act having the player rescue the 7 descendants of the 7 sages. Each game concludes with a final dungeon and then a showdown with the series' main antagonist. In this regard, Ocarina of Time remains true to its roots and very much feels like a Zelda game. Of course, what makes a Zelda game likely depends on where one began their personal adventure with the franchise. For many, this journey began in the 80s. The original Zelda overworld was an open experience. Outside of a couple of screens requiring the use of the raft, a player was free to travel the entirety of Hyrule at their leisure. For many others, their gaming odyssey began not on a home console, but rather a handheld. Link's Awakening took a different approach to overworld design. The structure follows a Metroidvania design philosophy. Most of the overworld is inaccessible at first, with new items and abilities allowing access to new areas of Koholint Island as the adventure unfolds. This gated progression system allowed the developers to control where a player could venture off to and when. Now, I do not find either the open world or Metroidvania style of overworld design inherently superior to the other. Some may prefer maximum player freedom, others may prefer something more methodical. Both styles can be executed with finesse, both can be executed poorly, and depending on one's entry point into the series, either system may be the definitive Zelda formula. Ocarina of Time feels like a hybrid of these two styles. Hyrule is a massive place, and the player is initially allowed to travel to a chunk of the overworld, exploring at their leisure. However, many areas are also gated off. Not as much as Link's Awakening, but certainly far less than the first game. Many areas are off limits, requiring an item or an ability in order to gain access. This also leads into linear versus non-linear progression. Zelda 1 is often credited with being an early example of an open-world game. The origin point in the franchise is sometimes used as a benchmark to which future games would be judged. Ocarina of Time is often criticized for not being open enough, using items as a form of progression progression gating and controlling the sequence in which a player accesses the temples, therefore deviating from a core element which made the franchise successful in the first place. However, I find this premise somewhat inaccurate. NES Zelda has 9 dungeons, but the player cannot visit and defeat them in the order of their choosing. Theoretically, a player can beat dungeons 1, 2, and 3 from the get-go, but 2/3 are gated. The other dungeons are either inaccessible without an item received from a previous dungeon, or the dungeon itself requires an item from a previous dungeon to actually complete. Dungeon 4 requires the raft from Dungeon 3 to access. Dungeons 5 and 6 require the ladder from Dungeon 4 to complete. Dungeon 7 requires the whistle obtained in Dungeon 5 to access. And of course, one needs to have collected the 8 Triforce pieces from Dungeons 1 through 8 in order to progress into the 9th dungeon. In fact, the dungeons are numbered 1 to 9, and outside of speedrunning or swordless runs, there is little reason for a player to beat them in a different order. Link's journey from the opening screen to the defeat of Ganon is mostly linear. While some might say I am missing the point, and there are dozens of combinations to conquer the dungeons, I would argue not all of these combinations would provide a quality experience. And in this regard, I don't find Ocarina of Time's linear dungeon order to be that outside of the series' norm, or its origins for that matter. Second, there is the question of the open world design of Hyrule. As noted, the player can visit virtually every area of Hyrule in the original adventure. Miyamoto is famously quoted as designing the land of Hyrule and the Legend of Zelda after his childhood exploration of nearby caves, lakes, fields, and forests. The original Zelda is often praised for being a realization of Miyamoto's vision, but I do feel this fact is often portrayed as good design, without actually exploring what these childhood memories mean from a gameplay perspective. In many ways, Ocarina of Time features these same childhood moments, just presented and unfolded in a different way. In short, I don't feel like Ocarina of Time marks a major departure from the original Zelda formula. Hyrule is a vast land with plenty of exploration available to the player, keeping the open world feel, while the dungeon progression remains linear, even if one doesn't remember the original Zelda the same way. Though I must admit, judging a game based on how much it sticks to an arbitrary and often changing formula would be doing a disservice to the game itself. There is certainly much more to explore in Ocarina of Time. Assuming gamers still care about Ocarina of Time on its hypothetical 40-year anniversary, I believe the two things which must stand the test of time will be the narrative and the gameplay. To fully understand the narrative of Ocarina of Time, we must go back to the year of its release. In 1998, Ocarina of Time was presented as a prequel to the first 4 games, with A Link to the Past being the final story. The opening crawl in A Link to the Past references the imprisoning war, where 7 sages successfully imprisoned Ganon in the Sacred Realm, closing the portal between the Sacred Realm and Hyrule. Playing these games in order, I continue to find myself drawn to the mystique of Hyrule, and how Ganon continues to want to conquer this land with the use of the Triforce. Each new game seems to reveal just a little more backstory and continues to flesh out the world, while still containing its own complete narrative. When I play Ocarina of Time, I am drawn to 2 main themes. First is the growth of Link from a lazy boy to the hero of time. It is quite the transformation, and the developers did a wonderful job getting the player from point A to point B with a natural and convincing progression as the story unfolds. The second theme I get out of the story is that of destiny. Ocarina of Time opens with 2 events. First, the player is offered a glimpse into a dream Link is having. In it, Link is standing in front of the gates of Hyrule Castle. He witnesses Princess Zelda racing out of the castle, seemingly in an escape, with a mysterious man not far behind. Link is visibly scared, and the man is presented as a villain. Next, there is narration by the Great Deku Tree, who explains Link must now fulfill his destiny. The Great Deku Tree even refers to Zelda as the Princess of Destiny, further cementing this theme. Throughout Ocarina of Time, it is made clear Link does not have a choice on what his future holds. Rauru tells Link his destiny is to be the hero of time. Sheik informs Link he has no choice but to look for the 5 temples and awaken the 5 stages. The Deku Tree Sprout tells Link the story of a young Link being the child of destiny. Even Link having the Triforce of Courage is explained as his destiny. In short, Link is the chosen one. Now, this is a classic storytelling trope, and having the game follow a prophecy where the ending is revealed to the player at the very start can lead to something unsatisfying. Thankfully, the developers did an admirable job showing why Link is the only one who can defeat Ganon. It is of critical importance the story clearly defines why the Chosen One is the only one who can defeat the antagonist. If this is never defined or explained, then the player will be left to wonder why someone else in Hyrule cannot rise to the occasion and defeat the antagonist themselves. Thankfully, the Zelda mythology has the Triforce and the Master Sword. Only the Hero of Time can pull the sword from its pedestal. When Ganon enters the Sacred Realm and steals the Triforce, it breaks into 3 parts, as his heart was not in balance. The Triforce of Wisdom and Courage ultimately land within Link and Zelda, signified by the marks on their hands. Ganondorf must then acquire the missing pieces if he wants the full power of the Triforce, which of course means taking them from Zelda and Link. As no one else in Hyrule has the Triforce, they will not be able to defeat Ganon themselves. It must be Link and Zelda. I must admit the Triforce does remain a bit ambiguous though. Is it a physical item one can hold above their head, or is it something more magical? The game isn't clear, but the ambiguity is part of the allure. This Chosen One prophecy plays into Link's growth from a boy to the Hero of Time as well. The gameplay itself is centered around this. It is the player's actions ultimately allowing Link to fulfill his destiny, which makes sense in an interactive medium. With each new weapon and item, each heart piece, new spell, Link is growing stronger as a hero, and the player is becoming more skillful too. Even better, Hyrule is filled with a wide cast of memorable characters. As a child, an owl appears offering wisdom and guidance to the player, keeping the story going while also alerting the player they are heading the right way. While the text speed could be faster, it is a decent way to offer more narrative during the middle of the game. In fact, Hyrule itself feels large and impressive, filled with a wide variety of races. There are the Hylians, Kokiri, Gorons, Zoras, Gerudos, and the Sheikah. The player even learns Ganon himself is a Gerudo. One of my few complaints with A Link to the Past was how barren it felt and how unmemorable the characters were. This was improved in Link's Awakening, and it feels as though the developers wanted to continue to flesh out the land of Hyrule in Ocarina. There is little doubt the land has come a long way since 1986, and I appreciate how each area in Hyrule feels distinct, with unique architecture, unique races complete with unique mannerisms, and even unique music. The fact most are likable further enhances the player's desire to want to save the world as well. The second element I feel will determine Ocarina's place in history is the gameplay. First, Link's movement is responsive and intuitive. Link moves in the direction the player presses on the analog stick, and there is no tank-like oddities to the controls, except Epona. The only negative I would have is the emulated ports on the GameCube or Virtual Console seem very twitchy, making walking along narrow paths more stressful than it should be. Still, changing directions feels modern. The combat too feels responsive, and the collision detection of the swordplay is surprisingly accurate. Even better is the targeting system. When Navi, a fairy which follows Link through the entire adventure, highlights an enemy or target, the player can press the trigger button to lock on. This serves 2 real purposes. First, it keeps the camera in a workable position. Second, it offers a secondary set of controls to the player when in targeted mode, letting the player hop backwards, side to side, and jump attack forwards. It is a good system, and in many ways feels just like a fully realized version of the advanced mechanics attempted in Zelda 2. As innovative as this likely was upon release, the system is far from perfect. Outside of pressing the C button to look and the trigger to reset the camera forward, there is no manual camera control. This of course is a product of the N64's controller, which lacks a second analog stick. This lack of control feels somewhat restrictive at first, and certainly lets a player know they are not playing something from this decade, though the developers mostly did a good job working around this limitation. Dungeons and temples are rarely cramped, meaning precise camera controls is not often necessary. Additionally, when the player does need precise control, it is usually after all of the enemies have been cleared out, letting the player look in first-person mode without needing to keep an eye out for enemies. There are moments where the camera betrays the player, however. First, there are moments where the player is required to be stealthy and not be seen by enemies, but the lack of real camera control means the player needs the target mode, which allows for strafing, but as Link pops his head out to see what is going on, he is obviously visible to the target which is supposed to be avoided, which makes for some sloppy moments. In this regard, the developer's ambition exceeds the gameplay engine, and these end up feeling dated as a result. Second, there are many flying enemies in Ocarina of Time. Without the ability to change the verticality of the camera on the fly, these enemies don't feel compatible with the control limitations. Now, Navi will target flying enemies, and once targeted, the projectile weapons work great. However, at times the game feels dumb, and Navi doesn't home in on the incoming target until it is too late, resulting in plenty of surprise attacks and touch damage. Now, one could attempt to use a projectile weapon manually and take down flying targets from a distance, but the analog controls are far too twitchy to be accurate, and the bow and slingshot lack a center reticle, further reducing the accuracy. Again, something veterans of the title may not notice or weigh heavily on the overall experience, but something someone new to the title is sure to notice right away. This combat system makes up a good portion of the temples as well, and by the time I got to the end of my first playthrough, it felt like second nature, and with the growing pains behind me, my second playthrough went relatively smooth. However, one issue which persisted despite being comfortable was the actual locking on mechanic. As the same button is used to face the camera forward, at times the player is required to press the button twice, first to reset the camera and a second time to target the enemy. Targeting requires Navi to actually target the enemy, of course, so there were many times, especially with bosses that rotated, where multiple presses were required to actually target an enemy. I found this boss fight against Bongo Bongo to be especially problematic, and I often would assume I had targeted a hand and then pulled out my bow, only to be in first-person view unexpectedly. Again, I'm sure I could learn to work around the Z targeting limitations on moving targets with additional playthroughs, but I also feel the developers could have designed this boss with the current control limitations in mind. So, generally speaking, I do feel a modern player would have few reasons to dislike Ocarina of Time thus far. The Chosen One's story arc is thoughtful, the land of Hyrule is interesting with a ton of memorable characters, Link controls well, the collision detection is good, and while the camera is limited and the targeting occasionally janky, it is at worst a minor nuisance. However, I do feel there are some issues which create a massive barrier of entry for first-time players. I suspect if I asked fans of the game how long it takes to get through this adventure, they might guess between 6 to 10 hours. There are 9 dungeons, so about an hour or so to get from beat to beat. This would seem fairly reasonable to me, but I don't think a first-time player would have this experience. My second playthrough took me 19 hours, and in case one thinks there's something wrong with me, this is actually an order of magnitude faster than the 1,500 players who have entered their playtime into the How Long to Beat database, with a main story time currently at over 26 hours. So, what on earth could take a new player this long to get through a 32 megabyte cartridge? Well, I do find there are moments in Ocarina of Time which are perhaps too cryptic. But backing up a bit, I mentioned at the beginning of the video, Ocarina is divided into 3 acts, 3 dungeons with young Link, 5 temples with adult Link, and the final castle and battles marking the end of the adventure. The first act follows the structure of A Link to the Past, and one could view this entire segment as a tutorial of sorts, before the player is required to take the reins and figure things out for themselves. Seriously, obtaining the 3 pendants and the magic mirror is straightforward enough, before the game becomes more open and demands more from the player. Ocarina of Time follows a similar structure. I suspect a gamer of any skill level could obtain the 3 spiritual stones, with one exception: pull the Master Sword from the pedestal and set off the chain reaction, ultimately leading to Ganondorf turning into a pig and letting the rest of the series exist. Actually, this is something that somewhat bothered me about the story. Young Zelda uses young Link to gather the spiritual stones, gives Link the Ocarina of Time, and tells him to pull the sword, which acts as a seal to the Sacred Realm, where the Triforce has been safely hiding. By breaking the seal, Ganon is able to enter the Sacred Realm and obtain the Triforce. Had Zelda not been so foolish and just left it sealed, none of this would have happened. Ganondorf wouldn't have obtained the Triforce of Power, and Hyrule would not need to be saved. Zelda made a mistake, although she does seem remorseful at the end, but still. Anyway, if you ask a player, perhaps a hypothetical player from the future, about their experience with Ocarina of Time, it is possible they said they eventually got stuck and quit playing, or kept playing but spent too much time wandering around, wondering what to do and where to go. Now, there are numerous ways in which Ocarina guides the player forward. Obviously, there is the owl, often flat out telling the player where to go next. Then there is Navi, which again will bark out orders on where to go next. And lastly, there is the map screen, which has a blinking intriguing indicator on where the player is supposed to go. On the surface, progression should be very straightforward, but in practice, Ocarina of Time has a number of speed bumps, which can bring progress to a screeching halt. The most famous is, of course, feeding a fish to Jabu Jabu so he opens his mouth. The solution to this puzzle is obvious once someone knows the solution. The store shows fish can be stored in jars. There are fish in the shallow ponds. Azora advises Jabu Jabu likes food. All of the clues are there for the player. But this is where a first playthrough of Ocarina of Time can become problematic. The player is required to talk to almost everyone in Hyrule to obtain the clues needed for progression, but it isn't always obvious which conversations are meaningful and which are not. I suspect when people remember Ocarina of Time, their favorite memories are not all of the conversations had during a first-time playthrough. I could be harsher on Zora's Domain as well. In order to even get to the Jabu Jabu section, a player has to play a minigame where they pay 20 rupees and practice their diving. This seems like a pointless minigame, and spending 20 rupees won't likely entice a player to give it a go. However, after accepting the offer, the player is then told they will receive something nice if they succeed. This critical information would have been extremely helpful before giving up 20 rupees. At least then the player would know this isn't a minigame, but rather required for progression. Beating the minigame rewards the silver scale, allowing better diving capabilities, which leads the player to a message in a bottle. What does one do with this message? Well, one can't read the message, and attempting to use it just indicates the item can't be used here. The player actually has to present it to King Zora. There is no clue or guidance that this required action must be taken. A player is left to just sort of figure it out. This talking to every NPC trope continues with another mandatory item. An NPC advises they saw Dompe drop into his grave. The seemingly random comment is mission critical, and hopefully a player notices a couple of the gravestones have 3 plants in front of them and figures out they can be pulled. A staple for Zelda fans, sure, but this might not be so obvious to newcomers. Anyway, after chasing the ghost through a maze, the player is rewarded the hookshot, which is needed to gain access to the entrance of the Forest Temple. And yeah, Ocarina of Time really did make the player walk from the Temple of Time through Hyrule Field to Kakariko Village, the graveyard, back through Kakariko Village, back to Hyrule Field, through Kokiri Forest, the Lost Woods, the Sacred Meadow Forest, just to get to the next temple. This time can be reduced somewhat with Epona, an optional though beneficial side quest which makes traversing through Hyrule Field and a couple other areas significantly faster, but still, there is a lot of messing about, and I wish the hookshot was just an item received in a less time-consuming way. It also makes me wish I could just fast travel from the menu screen, or wish there was more shortcuts in the world, or something like the flute in A Link to the Past. The biggest speed bump in the quest is the Lens of Truth. While not technically a required item, it is obvious the developers wanted the player to acquire it as part of the main quest, as so many items, stores, and puzzles demand its use. However, after clearing the Water Temple, there are 3 locations blinking on the map, and 2 of them are wrong. A player cannot generally get through the desert without the Lens of Truth, so there is no reason for this to be an active marker. Where the player wants to go is back to the Kakariko Village, where a cutscene plays showing a spirit escaping the bottom of the well. When a player enters the Shadow Temple, the next temple in the game, it is hinted the Eye of Truth is needed. However, in order to obtain the Eye of Truth, the player needs to speak to the man in the windmill, take out the ocarina, and learn the Song of Storms. With the song learned, the player needs to return to the present time and then re-enter the windmill as young Link. After targeting the man, the player should play the Song of Storms, which causes the windmill to go haywire and drain the well, mercifully allowing entrance to the bottom, which is no longer sealed. I don't understand why the game treats the Lens of Truth as an optional item, when it is damn near required for the rest of the game, and I don't understand why the game requires Link to return to the present to complete this task, which would create more time threads than needed to complete the quest. There is no reason this couldn't just be treated as another mini-dungeon for adult Link, like the Ice Cavern or Gerudo Training Grounds. It just adds unnecessary complexity and time where it isn't warranted. Overall, Ocarina of Time handles the optional items rather strangely. When in lava-filled areas, a timer will appear indicating how long Link can stand the heat. However, there's a Goron tunic available which offers Link heat resistance, making the Fire Temple and a few other areas in the game easier for newcomers. Same goes for the Zora tunic. Link's time underwater is limited, but becomes unlimited with the Zora tunic. Like the Lens of Truth, both tunics are almost mandatory and felt like they should have been handled as such, rather than forcing the player to go out of their way without any PC clues to obtain them. I would have preferred the game to guide the player to these items and then let experienced players skip them if they so choose. Weirdly, the optional Big Goron sword is obtained via a trade sequence. This lengthy trade sequence is actually clearly marked on the overworld map. That's right, during each leg of this trade sequence, the yellow arrow will point out where the next trade event occurs. Even stranger, the Big Goron sword is truly optional, unlike the Lens of Truth and the tunics, simply delivering double damage in exchange for a lack of a shield. The double damage is awesome, and I chose to spend an hour completing this quest because I felt it was worth it. But it strikes me as odd the player is guided through this side quest, but not others. Other optional things I chose to obtain were the fire arrows, 2 additional jars, the extended magic meter, the reduced damage upgrade, the Song of Sun, and of course, Epona. Epona is required to complete the Big Goron sword side quest though, and the Song of Sun lets the player skip through waiting 2 days for the sword to be completed. So, while an experienced Ocarina of Time player may be able to breeze through the adventure in a single sitting, I don't think a first-time player is going to have the same streamlined experience. Instead, they may get stuck and shut the game off, or spend countless extra hours wandering around looking for stuff and talking to NPCs rather than enjoying the best aspects of the game. In addition to the story elements and developed world, the highlight of Ocarina is the 9 dungeons and temples. Each of these follows a specific theme, helping them feel distinct from one another. Each present a new item or mechanic, offering something new for the player to do. Each contain fantastic musical compositions, and their compact nature allows for a tighter experience compared to the overworld. I might argue this is where the 3D aspects of the hardware are put to the best use as well. As one would expect, inside the deco tree highlights one of the best aspects of the new 3D engine, verticality. While this was flirted with in previous Zelda games, the potential is fully realized in Ocarina of Time. The player first ventures up the tree before using physics to break down into the bowels of the tree. This is also where the best design aspects of the adventure can be found. After receiving the slingshot, the player is trapped in a room with no seeming escape. The solution is to use the slingshot to hit the ladder, which drops, revealing the exit. The room is crafted thoughtfully, forcing the player to use logic to solve a minor puzzle, without Navi giving away the solution. The concept is reinforced later on, and reused as the game progresses. Dodongo's Cavern's main theme revolves around bombs. At first, the player is limited to using bomb flowers, but their locations nudge the player into opening up breakable walls and teach how to destroy the BMOs. The item found in this level is the bomb bag, allowing Link to graduate from bomb flowers to regular bombs. This dungeon also contains a memorable moment involving the epic Dodongo skeleton and the new item, with a cleverly written clue guiding the player, rather than novelly spoiling the solution. Inside Jabu Jabu's belly offers another unique set piece, the insides of a massive aquatic creature. This dungeon's main gimmick is the use of Rudo as a weight for activating switches. The player needs to take her from room to room for a while, but as she doesn't have AI and cannot take damage, this never feels annoying, and the playful banter is endearing. This dungeon also utilizes 3D space well, having the player drop down holes in the level geometry in specific spots to proceed. Link also obtains the boomerang in this dungeon, which can slice through the electrified enemies as well as snag faraway items. It also enhances combat by paralyzing enemies, adding depth. Of course, these properties were present in the original title. However, it is a tried and true mechanic I find engaging. After clearing the 3 young Link dungeons, it is then time for the player to attack the 5 adult Link temples. These temples increase the complexity by adding keys to the formula, small keys and boss keys. My first playthrough in the Forest Temple was actually hampered by the key system, and I constantly found myself 1 key short on the path I was on. However, on my second playthrough, my experience experience was much different. By starting on a different branch of the center room, I was on a path rewarding more keys than locked doors, making the experience smoother with less backtracking. I can't be certain if the temple should have guided me to this more efficient path, or if I should appreciate the fact repeat playthroughs yield different experiences. In any case, the main gimmick of this temple is the rotating room. By shooting at switches, a room will rotate, revealing different platforms and paths, gating progression forward until ultimately rewarding the player with the boss key. The Forest Temple also rewards the Fairy Bow, giving Adult Link a projectile weapon right away, which I like. Well, I guess the hookshot can be used as a weapon, but it is slow rather than instant. In addition to the rotating room, there is a complex block-pushing puzzle demanding the player understand the 3D space presented. The player will need to push a block, then travel upwards and then back downwards to push it from another angle to proceed. Though completely logical, I found myself somewhat confused in this space, and I appreciate the game forcing me to think spatially to solve this puzzle. Things slow down a bit in the Fire Temple. Another reoccurring puzzle in Ocarina is moving time blocks with the Song of Time. These are introduced in a lame way, with Navi pointing out the symbol resembles the Temple of Time, nudging the player to perform the Song of Time. Much like Zelda's Lullaby, this means anytime the player comes across the symbol, they just need to play the appropriate song, which stops becoming a puzzle rather quickly. Anyway, the Fire Temple rewards the Megaton Hammer, which feels like an underutilized weapon. It is mainly used to break rusted switches in temples or boulders in the overworld, and has more optional combat uses during the fight against Ganon when Link loses the Master Sword, and it can be used to cheese Dark Link. However, as the item has limited uses, this does add some non-linearity to the dungeon order. After obtaining the bow in the Forest Temple, a player can choose either the Fire Temple or the Water Temple as their next destination, for example. Players have found other sequence breaks as well, though I can't imagine beating the Spirit Temple without the feather boots found in the Shadow Temple. Speaking of boots, the next temple is the Water Temple. The perception of this dungeon has changed over the years. While researching reviews from 1998, I never found a complaint. As the years waned on, this became a notorious dungeon thanks to the complex layout, raising water gimmick, and the need to enter the menu to equip and unequip the iron boots. As video essay and analysis videos have become more popular in recent years, many gamers have found a new appreciation for this devilish temple, and many now declare it as the best temple in the game. It is a perfect example of a game aging, how perceptions change and evolve, and while games are a static medium, they certainly can age the same as other forms of art, like literature, film, and music. And like contemporary views, I do find the Water Temple to be fantastic. When the water is high, obstacles are obstructed like bombable walls and flammable torches. When the water is low, floating platforms sink, preventing access to certain doors. On a first-time playthrough, this can be overwhelming and confusing. However, on subsequent playthroughs, there is some method to the madness. By exploring each and every corridor at each water level, which is simple thanks to the grid-based nature of the center room, a careful player can minimize backtracking almost entirely, and the clever camera even clues the player into locations that might not be initially obvious. My only quibble with the entire dungeon would be in regards to the map screen. Once the long shot is obtained, which increases the distance of the hook shot, there are two chests left on the map screen. One is the boss key, the other is a small key. On this playthrough, I chose the wrong path and ended up wasting a ton of time reaching a locked door, and was then forced to backtrack and ultimately repeat the section. Other than that, I enjoyed how the stage challenged me to explore methodically and think spatially to reveal all of the areas and find all of the keys. One could also complain about the iron boots not being mapped to a C button, creating extra menu navigation, but this never bothered me. For one, so few items are needed in this dungeon, and I didn't find myself in the menu very long in the first place, and two, this is Ocarina of Time. The game's main gimmick, and something often praised, is a slow item to use. Equipping the iron boots is significantly faster than playing a song and waiting for the animation to play out every single time. Unless I am ready to declare the Ocarina a massive waste of time, I don't think I can fault the iron boots' oversight too harshly. Item management is something I find engaging as well, and something that never bothered me in past games. Anyway, after the mind-bending Water Temple, the remaining two temples are surprisingly tame, short, and linear. The Shadow Temple relies on the Lens of Truth to locate hidden walls and platforms. There are also machines generating wind, with the player using the iron boots to stop its effects, or use the hover boots to get a wind boost. Unlike the Megaton Hammer, I do feel the developers did a good job of finding new ways to use the footwear. The last temple is the Spirit Temple. This requires the player to return to the present time as young Link to crawl through a small opening at the beginning and find an item for adult Link, and then return to the future and utilize adult Link to complete the temple. Again, I have to ask myself if these forced time travel moments were really necessary in the adventure as a whole. I like it from a narrative standpoint in the growth of Link, but the gameplay applications are far more underwhelming. So, with the 5 temples defeated, the second act of Ocarina of Time is complete. Link has awakened the 6 sages and is ready to take on Ganondorf. The third act begins with a plot twist. Sheik turns out to be none other than Princess Zelda, and also the 7th sage, meaning she too has gone on a journey from naive girl to warrior princess. This might even make for an interesting game in itself. But same as before, this reveal is noticed by Ganon, who has been patiently waiting to find the locations of the Triforce of Courage and Wisdom, so he can have them for himself. With Zelda kidnapped, it is time for Link to enter Ganon's castle, with a rainbow bridge being revealed after awakening the sages. This final dungeon is awesome. There are 6 areas to get through, each acting as a mini obstacle course of sorts based on the previous temples visited. I appreciate how pushing statues is now used to change the behavior of hazards, rather than being a tiresome chore for pushing a button, and how the hover boots prevent this platform from sinking into the lava. Rather than feeling like a rehash, this dungeon still feels fresh, presenting new obstacles for the player to overcome. Sadly, this level of freshness doesn't quite permeate the final boss encounter with Ganondorf. Actually, I'm not sure if any of the boss encounters are all that great if I'm honest. Each requires a different strategy to defeat, sure, but the fights are either easy or cumbersome, with few feeling like an epic battle. For Goma, I stunned the arachnid with a Deku Nut, and then jump attacked with the sword while she was stunned. One could also use the fairy slingshot to speed up the battle, but again I found the aiming too sensitive and imprecise without a reticle. King Dodongo is remarkably easy as well. The boss will occasionally stop to inhale air, which is the cue for the player to launch a bomb into its mouth. If successful, the boss will be stunned, allowing for attacks. What makes this battle easy is how the player doesn't really need to dodge or run from the boss, just stand off to the side. Baronade is one fight which gave me a lot of issues, similar to Bongo Bongo. With the constant need to move around, I often found I would lose my targeting, causing the camera to whip back in a jarring manner, and the constant moving away from the boss made reacquiring the target to be counterintuitive. It does utilize the boomerang though, following the game's formula of using the acquired item in the boss fight. Phantom Ganon is perhaps the most clever fight in the game. First, it utilizes the first-person view very well, playing to the strengths of the camera and mechanics available in the game. Second, it requires timing and precision to be successful. The player has a 50-50 chance of guessing which phantom is the real phantom galloping in the painting. If wrong, the player needs to quickly find the real phantom and strike with an arrow fast, or suffer a devastating attack. I do find it odd this challenging boss is found in the middle of the game though, rather than near the end. Both Phantom Ganon and the Water Temple really break the difficulty progression of the adventure, and I feel both could have been pushed more towards the end to balance things out. Volvagia is another wait for an opening boss. The player just dodges simple patterns and waits for the idle period when they can strike with the temple's item, the Megaton Hammer. Morpha is equally boring. The player needs to wait around until they can grab the nucleus with the long shot, then strike it with the sword. Last but not least is Twin Rova, a pair of Gerudo witches. This again utilizes the dungeon's item, this time the Mirror Shield. I should mention the first phase of this fight seems to require the player to not utilize the targeting, as the player needs full shield movement to reflect the energy beam. So the variety is nice, but the twitchy problem persists. Some of the mini-bosses are equally disappointing. The Big Octo is an endurance test, as the player must use the boomerang to stun its face, then race around to the back to inflict damage before the stun period is over. Dark Link is a callback to The Adventure of Link, and like that game, a straight-up sword fight is about the least effective way to tackle the challenge. On this recorded run, I just ignored the targeting system and rapidly attacked with the sword, which was enough to win. However, a better strategy is to just use the Megaton Hammer, which breaks breaks the fight. This leads us back to the final boss encounter against the main antagonist. Ganondorf mirrors the Phantom Ganon fight from earlier, with a game of energy tennis. While seemingly silly, I do like how this feels like Link finally growing up from that first encounter where Link gets boned. As a skillful adult, Link can now deflect the energy and use it against Ganondorf, signifying growth, which I like. What happens next tickles my nostalgia bone. The player finally gets to see Ganondorf transform from the legendary King of Thieves to the pig monster Ganon depicted in the earlier games. While not necessary, it is a touch of polish I like. In this fight, Link first has to attack with an alternate weapon as the Master Sword is knocked away, but then finishes the fight with the legendary blade. This fight is more symbolic than anything and isn't difficult thanks to the rolling. Ocarina of Time concludes with the 7 sages sealing Ganon into the Sacred Realm, where he waits until a new Link and a new Zelda encounter him again in the future. Well, until Nintendo retconned everything. So, with the adventure over, a conclusion must be reached. Will Ocarina of Time always be regarded as a masterpiece, or will time erode the luster much like it has the original game? In my view, I don't think opinions of Ocarina will remain so rosy as time wears on. We can see hints of this by looking at review scores from 2011, which certainly don't quite match the original scores from 1998. As 3D worlds are no longer a new exciting thing, I feel the novelty of wandering a 3D Hyrule is no longer as enthralling as it once was. This mirrors my feelings of the original Zelda. Wandering the massive overworld may have been an exciting new thing upon release, but there really isn't that much to uncover with all that exploring. The best parts of the game are the dungeons, and unless one has a guide, getting from dungeon to dungeon can be a grind. Ocarina of Time feels much the same. The game is paced extremely slowly, and it takes forever to get from dungeon to dungeon. Again, this isn't a new phenomenon. The original 1998 review on IGN references playing the game for 17 hours straight, and then finishing the game the next day. And in my opinion, this slow pace is what will be most prominent to the next generation of gamers. From the painfully slow text speed in most situations, to the sluggish navigation until one figures out how to unlock Epona, to the vague and confusing clues directing players to mandatory items, to optional items beneficial to new players not being obvious, to the map system incorrectly pointing the player in multiple directions at once instead of just numbering them like a Link to the Past. One might not remember just how long Ocarina of Time really is to the uninitiated. And this is a real shame. The story segments are deep and thought-provoking, and my opinions are still not cemented as I write these words. The themes stick with me long after I've put the controller down, and I wouldn't mind reliving the grand adventure to obtain more perspective. Same goes for the dungeons. I want to play them again and discover new clever clues and discover new awesome bits of game design to ooh and ah over. Unfortunately, the amount of time it takes to get to these great beats is far too slow and cryptic. It is these lulls in the action, the wandering, the confusion, the slow points, which will likely stand out to new players. And ultimately, when we are all long gone and the next generation of players is deciding Ocarina of Time's ultimate place in gaming history, it is their experiences which will ultimately prevail. Much like how gamers of today rarely appreciate the games of a bygone era, I don't think Ocarina of Time will always be so highly regarded. It isn't flawless. The camera isn't as good as one might remember. The enemy counters aren't as epic as one might remember. The pacing isn't as brisk as one might remember. Ocarina of Time isn't the masterpiece one might have created in their memories. Of course, it is perfectly reasonable to also accept one acknowledging these flaws, but weighing them differently and reaching a different conclusion. I don't find these elements to be a nitpick either. A nitpick would be how grabbing a new item puts the sword away, how Navi frequently gives away answers to puzzles, how poor Link's swimming animation is, how the context-sensitive action button is too slow to change, how the dive button seems to be on a delay, and how the lens of truth doesn't reveal the traps and treasure chests. The pacing of a game, what one experiences for those dozens of hours, is important. While I appreciate the game for what it is, I ultimately cannot find a masterpiece buried within the bits and bytes of Link's first 3D adventure. Rather, I find a good first draft.